The coffee was still hot. That is the detail I keep coming back to in the weeks since that Sunday. Not what my son said, not the faces of the people around us when he said it, not the specific quality of the silence that followed, which was the kind of silence that has texture to it, the kind you can feel against your skin like a change in air pressure before a storm that has already decided where it is going. Not the way Jennifer looked at her plate, not the way the two women from her graduate program suddenly became very interested in their mimosas. Not any of those things. The coffee was still hot. I had been there for 11 minutes. I know this because I had looked at my watch when I sat down. An old habit from 30 years of running job sites where time was the one resource you could not recover once it was gone, where every hour that slipped past its scheduled use cost someone money, and sometimes cost someone a great deal more than money. And the coffee had arrived at the 8-minute mark because the waiter was efficient and the restaurant was the kind of place that understood the rhythm of a Sunday brunch crowd and kept things moving. And my son had said what he said at the 11-minute mark, and I had 3 minutes of hot coffee left in the cup when I decided what to do with the rest of the morning. I finished it, slowly, not as performance. The coffee was good, a dark roast, well made, the kind of coffee that deserves to be finished rather than abandoned. And I was 57 years old, and I had been driving since 7 in the morning, and I had earned the coffee, and I was not going to waste it because my son had lost his composure in a brunch restaurant in Columbus on a Sunday in September. I set the cup down. I put some bills on the table for what I had ordered. I nodded once, not in agreement, not in the way of a man who has been told a true thing and is acknowledging its truth, exactly, but in the way of a man who has received a piece of information and is filing it in the correct place before deciding what to do next. A structural nod. The nod of a person who has looked at a load-bearing problem and understood what it is. And then I put on my jacket, and I said, to the table generally, without emphasis, without performance, the way you say something when you mean it, and do not need the meaning underlined, I hope everyone has a good rest of their Sunday. And I left. My name is Thomas Garrett. I am 57 years old. I have spent 31 years as a structural engineer, and then as the owner and managing principal of an engineering consultancy based in Cincinnati, Ohio, Garrett Structural Associates, which I founded in 1994 with a business partner named Don Mallory, who retired in 2015 and whose equity I bought out over 5 years, in a process that was one of the more complex professional negotiations of my career and also one of the cleanest. The firm has, in its 31 years, produced work on bridges and public buildings and highway infrastructure and one significant dam rehabilitation project in eastern Kentucky that I am still prouder of than almost anything else I have put my name on. Work that will outlast me by a century if the maintenance schedules are followed, and by considerably longer if they are not, which is how most infrastructure works in this country, but that is a different problem, and not the one I am here to talk about. This is the story of a Sunday morning in September, a cup of coffee I was not going to waste, and the sentence my son screamed at me in front of 11 people in a brunch restaurant on a tree-lined street in Columbus, Ohio, where he has lived for the past 6 years, and what happened the next morning, which I did not plan and did not engineer, and which was not, despite what some people's first instinct might be in hearing this story, about me at all. Let me start with my father, because he is relevant, and because I have been thinking about him more than usual in the weeks since the Sunday, which is not something I can fully explain except to say that the particular way my father taught me to be in the world is the thing I was drawing on in the 11 minutes I sat at that table, and I want you to understand where it came from before I tell you what I did with it. My father's name was Robert Garrett. He grew up in Dayton, Ohio, the oldest of 3 boys in a family where money was not discussed at the table because discussing it at the table would have required acknowledging how little there was of it, and acknowledging that was not something his father, my grandfather, a man named Earl who worked in a glass factory for 40 years, was equipped to do. My father understood, by the time he was 12, that the way out of the particular shape of life his family occupied was through work and through silence, work that was relentless and silence that was strategic, the kind of silence that accumulates over time into a kind of authority that other people can feel in a room without being able to name it. He became a civil engineer, worked for the Ohio Department of Transportation for 28 years, designed roads and bridges and the occasional overpass that you have probably driven over without knowing his name, which is exactly the way he would have wanted it. He retired at 62, healthy, with a pension that covered his needs and a house that was paid off and a reputation in the professional community that meant something to the people who were in a position to understand what it meant. He taught me 2 things primarily. The first was finish what you start, not as a moral principle, but as a practical one. The job is not done until it is done, and the coffee is not finished until the cup is empty, and if something is worth beginning, it is worth completing, and if it is not worth completing, you should not have begun it. He applied this to work, to conversations, to the vegetable garden he kept in the backyard of the house in Dayton, that he maintained with the same methodical attention he brought to everything else, planting in the right season and harvesting at the right time and composting what didn't get used, because waste was, to him, a form of dishonesty, a failure to follow through on the implicit promise of beginning. The second was, the most important moment in any structural failure is not the moment the structure falls. By the time it falls, everything that mattered has already happened. The most important moment is the moment when the engineer first sees the stress fracture and decides what to do about it. Everything after that is consequence. I have thought about that second lesson more times than I can count in 31 years of engineering work, and I have thought about it in the weeks since September, in relation to my son, in relation to the fracture I first noticed when he was about 15, and which I made a series of decisions about that I am still accounting for. My son's name is Kevin. He is 34 years old. He is tall, which he gets from me. I am 6'2", he is 6'1", which he has always treated as a personal slight of some kind, the missing inch, as though I shaved it off deliberately. And he has a precision about the way he argues, a tendency to find the exact word that will do the most damage and deliver it at the exact moment when the damage will be most complete, which he does not get from me. I am a precise person professionally, but my precision is structural rather than verbal. I know how to find the load point, not the pressure point. Kevin knows how to find the pressure point. He has known this since he was about 12, and discovered that this particular skill gave him leverage in arguments that his size and his age did not yet give him. I watched him discover it. I did not do enough in the years that followed to redirect it toward something other than damage. Kevin works in financial analysis in Columbus for a firm that manages investment portfolios for institutional clients, pension funds, university endowments, the kind of money that moves slowly and carefully and requires people who can hold a complex picture in their heads and see the risks that are not obvious yet. He is genuinely good at this work. His supervisor, a woman I met once at a company event several years ago, told me privately that Kevin was one of the most analytically capable people on her team, and that his ability to identify hidden risk in a portfolio was exceptional. She said it the way people say things when they genuinely mean them, without the social inflation that usually attaches to compliments about someone's child in front of a parent. He married his wife Jennifer in 2018. They met in graduate school. Kevin has a master's in financial economics. Jennifer has a master's in communication sciences and disorders, which is the formal name for the discipline that trains speech therapists. Jennifer is quiet and careful in conversation, the kind of person who listens with her full attention before she responds, and who, when she responds, says exactly what she means in exactly as many words as the meaning requires. Not more, not fewer. She is the kind of person I find it very easy to be in a room with because she does not require management and she does not perform. And she has, from the first time I met her, treated me with a directness that I took, correctly I think, as a form of respect. I want to tell you about Kevin's mother, Patricia, because without her, without the specific shape of what happened between Patricia and me, and what happened between Kevin and the aftermath of that, the rest of this story does not make sense in the way it actually is, which is more complicated and more fair to everyone involved than the version that is easy to tell. Patricia and I met in Tisicha Davidsot Vosum Desat Sim at Ohio State. She was studying education. I was studying civil engineering. We were 20 and 21, respectively, which in retrospect explains a great deal about why we made the decisions we made and why those decisions produced the outcomes they produced. We were both serious people, both from families that had taught us to work hard and not expect things to be given, and we recognized in each other a quality of seriousness that felt, at 20 and 21, like compatibility. It may have been compatibility in certain ways and for certain purposes. It was not, as it turned out, the foundation of a marriage that was going to hold over the long term, and the thing that made this genuinely difficult rather than simply unfortunate was that neither of us understood this until we had already been married for 8 years and had a 6-year-old son, and had built enough of a life together that the dismantling of it was going to cost everyone involved something real. The divorce in Tisicha Davidsot Devanos Sim was not violent. There was no dramatic rupture, no infidelity, no single event that you could point to and say, that was the thing. There was, instead, the slow and thorough discovery that two people who are both serious and both hard-working and both capable of building things on their own are not necessarily capable of building things together, because the way I built things, methodically, step by step, with the full picture held in my head before I started, was not the way Patricia built things. Intuitively, responsively, with a tolerance for uncertainty that I did not have, and that she found over 8 years genuinely difficult to live alongside. We were, as Carol, my second wife, once put it with her characteristic precision, two load-bearing walls that were both strong and both structural, and also positioned in a way that made the space between them too narrow to occupy comfortably. We divorced in Tisicha Davidsot Devanos Sim. Kevin was 6. The custody arrangement was joint, on paper. In practice, Kevin lived primarily with Patricia, who remained in Columbus, while I took a position in Cincinnati that became the basis of the consultancy I founded 2 years later. I drove to Columbus every other weekend for the first 4 years without missing a single trip. 2 hours each way every other Friday evening when I left the office by 4 and drove east on I-71 with the particular focus of a man who has committed to being somewhere and intends to be there, and every other Sunday afternoon when I drove back. Kevin had his weekends with me, and I had those weekends, and I want to tell you honestly that they were good weekends, at least in the early years. We went to the Science Museum and the Zoo and the Natural History Museum that Kevin developed a specific passion for when he was 8 and 9, the fossils particularly, the evidence of creatures that had existed for millions of years and left their shapes in stone. We cooked together in the apartment I was renting in Oakley, a neighborhood in Cincinnati with good restaurants and a park where we walked on Saturday mornings when the weather permitted. I taught him to ride a bike in a parking lot near the apartment one October Saturday when he was 8 years old, and he fell twice and got back up both times without crying, which told me something about him that has been true in every version of him since. In 2001, Patricia remarried. His name was Bill Hendricks. He was a good man. I want to say this clearly and without qualification because the version of this story that would be easy to tell would cast Bill as a usurper, as the person who moved into space that was rightfully mine, and that would be unfair and inaccurate. Bill Hendricks was a decent, steady, present man who coached Kevin's Little League team for 4 years and who was at the breakfast table every morning and who drove Kevin to school and who was there on Tuesday evenings and on random Wednesday afternoons when something had happened and Kevin needed someone, and who was, in the daily, ordinary, irreplaceable ways of a person who is simply there, simply there. I was 2 hours away. I want to be very precise about what that means and what it does not mean, because both things are true and both things matter. What it means, I was not available on Tuesday evenings. I was not the person Kevin could come to with a specific unscheduled need of a child or an adolescent. The thing that happens on a Wednesday afternoon that does not fit into a calendar. I was a scheduled presence in his life, and scheduled presence is real, and it is not nothing, but it is also not the same as daily presence. And a child who grows up with a scheduled father and a daily stepfather carries that distinction, whether or not he has language for it at the time. What it does not mean, I was not there. I was at the appendix surgery when Kevin was 14. I drove to Columbus at 11 o'clock at night when Patricia called me, and I sat in the hospital waiting room for 4 hours. And I was there when Kevin came out of recovery, and he was 14 and still young enough that having his father physically present in that room mattered to him in a way he did not try to conceal, which told me something I needed to know and which I held on to in the years after when the relationship between us got harder to navigate. I drove back to Cincinnati the next morning. I was at the high school graduation. I was at the Ohio State move-in, carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs in August heat, with Kevin and a boy from his floor named Marcus, who became his roommate and who is still, as far as I know, one of Kevin's closest friends. I was at the college visit to Ohio State the previous spring when Kevin was still deciding, and we walked the campus together on a clear day in April, and he asked me, somewhere near the engineering quad, whether I had ever regretted becoming an engineer instead of something else, and I told him the truth, which was that engineering had never felt like a choice the way other things felt like choices. It had felt like what I was from the beginning, the way some people feel about music or mathematics, and that I thought he should find the thing that felt like that for him and not worry about whether it impressed anyone. He had nodded and gone quiet in the way he went quiet when something landed. He studied economics and finance. He was right to. The 4 days. I want to tell you about the 4 days because they are the specific thing Kevin named on Sunday, and they deserve to be named here too. When Kevin was 18, in the fall of his senior year of high school, he was in the process of deciding where to apply to college. He had a list of schools, he had his grades, he had his SAT scores, and he had the particular anxiety of a person who is making a decision that feels enormous and who does not yet have enough experience to know that most decisions that feel enormous are not as permanent as they feel. He needed to talk to someone. He called me on a Thursday. I was in the middle of a site crisis on a bridge project in northern Cincinnati. A subcontractor had installed a beam section out of specs, and we had caught it at inspection, and the question of how to address it without blowing the project timeline was the kind of problem that, in the moment, felt like it required my personal attention every hour. I did not call Kevin back until Monday. 4 days. He needed his father, and his father called back 4 days later. He went to Ohio State anyway. It was the right school for him. And he arrived at that conclusion without me, which is a different thing from arriving at it with me, even if the destination is the same. The destination being the same does not make the journey the same. And I have known this, and I have carried it, and I have never adequately explained to Kevin that I have carried it, because the conversation for that has not yet happened. It will happen. That is one of the things I know now that I want to say clearly. It will happen. I want to tell you about Carol before I tell you about the Thursday call that preceded the Sunday, because Carol is the context for everything I did well in the past 2 decades, and for most of the things I understood about myself in that time that I would not have understood without her. Carol's full name is Carol Ann Garrett, née Whitfield. She is 55 years old. She grew up in Lexington, Kentucky, the daughter of a high school history teacher and a woman who ran a small accounting practice from an office in their house. And she has, from both of these inheritances, an ability to hold the long view and the detailed view at the same time that is rarer than it sounds and more useful than almost any other quality I can name in a person you are building a life with. Carol is a landscape architect. She designs public spaces, urban parks, green corridors in city centers, the kind of outdoor environments that people use every day without thinking about the fact that someone spent months making decisions about them. She is good at her work in the way of a person who is doing what she was built to do. She has won recognition for it, which she is genuinely modest about. Not in the performed way of people who are practicing modesty, but in the real way of someone who is more interested in the next project than in the acknowledgement of the last one. I met Carol in 2003 at a professional conference in Cleveland where we were seated next to each other at a dinner on the second evening and talked for 3 hours. I drove back to Cincinnati the next morning and spent the entire drive thinking about the conversation, which is not something that happens often enough in a life to be dismissed when it does. We married in 2006. She understood going in what she was marrying into. A man who had a son in Columbus from a prior marriage, a man who drove east every other weekend and drove back on Sunday afternoons, a man whose relationship with that son was real and also complicated and also, in certain respects, in need of repair that the man had not yet figured out how to do. She did not simplify any of this. She engaged with it the way she engaged with a complicated sight. She walked it. She looked at it from multiple angles. She identified what was there before she started thinking about what to change. She said to me, early in our marriage, when Kevin was 15 and difficult in the way that 15-year-old boys with complicated relationships to their fathers are difficult. Tom, he does not need you to fix anything. He needs you to be in the room with him without an agenda, without outcomes, without the part of you that is always thinking 3 moves ahead. I said, I don't have an agenda when I'm with Kevin. She said, you have an agenda in every room you enter. It is one of the things that makes you exceptional at your work, and one of the things that makes you hard to be a teenager around. Teenagers need someone who is just present, not solving, not optimizing, just there. The presence is the thing. I said, I know how to be present. She said, you know how to be present in the engineering sense. You know how to give your full attention to a problem. Kevin is not a problem. I said, I know he's not a problem. She said, then stop trying to solve him and just be in the room with him. I got better at it. Not good. I want to be honest about this and not claim more progress than I actually made, but better. The distance between not good and better in matters of being present with a person who has needed more of you than you knew how to give is not a small distance, and I have been covering it slowly in both directions sometimes for nearly 20 years. Carol has been the one reading the terrain when my own reading of it was insufficient. She has been the reason the relationship between Kevin and me did not become something that could not be repaired during the years when it could have become that, because she was the one who understood what was needed when I did not. The Thursday call came 3 weeks before the Sunday. Kevin called on a Thursday evening in the second week of September. He sounded like a man who has had a drink or two in the early evening, not drunk, not incapacitated, but with that specific loosening of the usual structure of his voice that I have been noticing in occasional phone calls over the past couple of years, with the attention of a person who has filed something under watching, but has not yet found the right moment to address it. He said he wanted to talk about the house. Kevin and Jennifer had bought a house in Columbus in 2020, a 4-bedroom colonial in a neighborhood I knew from the years I had driven through Columbus. Good trees, well-maintained sidewalks, the kind of neighborhood where the houses hold their value because the people in them take care of them. The house required a down payment that was more than Kevin and Jennifer had been able to save, given that they were both carrying graduate school debt and had been working in their fields for only a few years at the time of the purchase. Kevin had asked me to contribute toward the down payment. He had asked carefully and with the specific discomfort of a person who finds asking for money genuinely uncomfortable, which told me something about him that I found reassuring, that whatever else was complicated between us, he had not developed the easy entitlement that some children of financially comfortable parents develop. I contributed $40,000. Carol and I had talked about it before I wrote the check, and she had said, "Tom, give it freely or don't give it. If there is a condition attached, even in your own mind, it will pull something eventually." I gave it freely. I did not keep a ledger. I did not attach a condition or an expectation. The Thursday call was Kevin telling me that he and Jennifer were exploring a refinance, and that the refinance would qualify for a meaningfully better rate if they had additional equity in the property, and that he was wondering whether I might be able to help with that. He said, "Not a lot, 30 or 40,000, just enough to get us to the threshold." I said, "I need to think about it." He said, "How long?" I said, "A few days." And then he said the thing that told me the Thursday call was not actually about the refinance. He said, "I just feel like you owe me this, Dad, given everything." I held the phone. I said, "What does given everything mean, Kevin?" He said, "You know what it means." I said, "I'd like to hear you say it." He did not say it. He said he would talk to me later, and the call ended, and I sat in my office with the Cincinnati evening outside the window, and I thought about those 2 words, given everything, and what they contained, and what they were asking for, and what they were not asking for, but were actually about. I talked to Carol that evening. I told her the full conversation. She listened the way she always listens, without reaching for a response before the thing being said had been fully said. When I finished, she said, "What does he mean by it?" I said, "I think he means the divorce, the distance, the every other weekend, the 4 days." She said, "Does he know what those things cost you?" I said, "I have thought about that question for 20 years. He knows what they cost him. He does not know what they cost me, because I have never told him, because telling him would have required a conversation I did not know how to have." She said, "Do you think he is asking for money or asking for something that money is standing in for?" I said, The second one. She said, "What is the something?" I said, "An acknowledgment that it happened, that I know it cost him something, that I am sorry it cost him something. Not because it could necessarily have been different given everything that was true about the situation at the time, but because the cost was real, regardless of whether it was avoidable, and a cost that is real deserves to be acknowledged, not explained away." She said, "Have you ever said that to him?" I said, "Not in those words, not in any words, really." She said, "Tom." I said, "I know." She said, "You need to go to Columbus, not to fix the refinance question, to have the real conversation." I said, "He's having brunch with Jennifer and some friends on Sunday. He said I could come." She said, "That is not the setting for the real conversation." I said, "I know, but it's a start, and I need to see him in person. I need to tell him about the refinance in person and then find a way to open the door to the real conversation." She said, "Be careful." I said, "Of what?" She said, "Of how much he's been drinking lately. I've noticed it in his voice when he calls. You have, too." "I had," I said. "I know." She said, "Whatever happens Sunday, come home and tell me." The restaurant was on a street I knew from the years of Columbus visits, a commercial strip in a neighborhood that had been changing since Kevin moved there, the kind of street where the coffee shops featured single-origin pour-overs and the brunch spots served cocktails before noon, and the people who filled the tables on Sunday mornings were mostly in their late 20s and 30s, in the specific phase of life where careers are being built and families are starting to feel possible, and the world has not yet delivered the harder versions of the things it is still preparing to deliver. I parked 2 blocks away and walked. It was a clear September morning, the first genuinely cool one of the fall, the kind of morning where the light is still warm, but the air has made its decision about the direction things are going. My father used to call September the honest light, the light that shows things the way they actually are, without the flattery of summer softening everything, and without the gray of winter making everything austere. It was honest light that morning. There were 11 people at the table when I arrived. Kevin and Jennifer, 3 couples who were their friends from the neighborhood. I recognized 2 of them from a summer barbecue the previous year, and 2 women I had not met before who turned out to be friends of Jennifer's from her graduate program at Ohio State in Columbus for the weekend. Kevin introduced me around the table with the easy authority of a man on his own ground, and there were the usual pleasantries, and the waiter brought coffee, and I sat down across from Kevin, and I could see, even before a word of consequence had been spoken, that the quality of the Thursday evening was still present in him. Some people carry things in their jaw. Kevin does this, a tightness, a slight forward set, that is so subtle that you would not notice it if you had not spent 34 years learning to read the face of a person you love. And I have spent 34 years learning to read Kevin's face, imperfectly, across the distance of 2 hours in every other weekend, and the particular incompleteness of a relationship that has been built in windows, rather than in the continuous time that relationships need to grow into their full size. I read it now across the table at 8 in the morning on a Sunday in September, and I understood. He had decided something before I arrived. He was here to do something. The brunch was cover for the something. I ordered coffee. I made conversation with the couple to my left. He was a pharmacist. She was a pediatric medical resident at Nationwide Children's Hospital. Both of them in the early years of demanding careers, building the kind of life where the demands of the work and the demands of the rest of existence are still being negotiated, which is a negotiation that takes longer than anyone tells you it will. The conversation was genuine, and I was glad of it, because it gave me something real to do while Kevin arranged himself for what he had decided was going to happen. The coffee came at the 8-minute mark. At 11 minutes, Kevin said, "Did you think about what I asked you?" The table did not go quiet. Not yet. The other conversations continued at their ambient level. But I felt the slight shift in the quality of Kevin's attention, the focusing of it toward me. And I knew that whatever I said next was going to determine whether we had a conversation or something else. I said, "I did." He said, "And?" I said, "I don't think I can help with the refinance the way you're describing. Not right now." The table went fractionally quieter, not silent. The pediatric resident and the pharmacist were still talking, but with that slight reduction in ambient noise that tells you the people nearby have tuned in without wanting to appear to have tuned in. He said, "Why not?" I said, "Because I gave you $40,000 for the house 4 years ago, and I gave it freely, and I'm glad I did. And what you said on Thursday, the give and everything, I want to talk about that, but not as a reason for additional money, as a real conversation about what happened and what it cost, which I think we have been needing to have for a long time." He looked at me. He said, "You want to talk?" I said, "Yes." He said, "What is there to talk about?" And I heard it, those 4 words delivered with a flatness that was not absence of feeling, but the opposite, the specific flatness of feeling so large it had been compressed into something that sounded controlled until the control gave way. And I knew, with the certainty you get from 34 years of watching someone, that whatever had been decided before I arrived was about to arrive. He said, and the words began to come faster and less controlled, the way water moves when the pressure behind it exceeds the structure containing it. "What is there to talk about, Dad? You weren't there. You drove down every other weekend, and you showed up with plans and with money and with your whole engineer's approach to everything, like there was a problem to solve, like if you just found the right solution, the whole situation would resolve cleanly. And then you got back in your car and drove to Cincinnati, and I was 6, and then I was 12, and then I was 16, and Bill was there every day, at every game, at every practice, every Tuesday evening when I needed to talk to someone. And I understand the divorce was complicated and the distance was real, and I understand you made the drive. I know you made the drive. But making the drive every other weekend is not the same as being there, Dad. It is not the same thing, and you know that," Jennifer said quietly. "Kevin," he said, "I'm not finished." He looked at me. His voice went up, not into shouting, into something adjacent to it, the specific volume of a thing that has been contained for a very long time in a very small space and has run out of room. He said, "You were never a real father. You showed up, and you brought the money, and you put it in the schedule, and you checked the box, and you went home. That is what you did. That is the whole of it for 30 years. And now, when I ask you for something real, when I ask you for something that actually costs you something beyond writing a check, you want to have a conversation. You want to sit down and process and discuss and talk about our feelings, like talking about it changes anything. Like having a conversation in a restaurant in Columbus in September undoes 30 years of every other weekend and 4 days. 11 people at the table. The pharmacist and the pediatric resident to my left had found urgent interest in their plates. Jennifer was looking at Kevin with an expression I could see from where I was sitting. Not surprise, not agreement, not the expression of a wife who has been waiting for her husband to finally say the thing she had been thinking. Something more complicated, something that contained knowledge of a history I was only partly aware of. Kevin was looking at me. I looked back at him. I thought about everything. I thought about the parking lot in Cincinnati in October 1999 and the kid who fell twice and got up both times without crying. I thought about the appendix at 14 and the 4 hours in the waiting room and the drive back the next morning. I thought about the 4 days. I thought about the 4 days the way I have thought about them 1,000 times, without flinching and without excuse, because they do not deserve flinching from, and they do not have an excuse that is worth the breath it would take to offer it. I thought about my father's second lesson. The most important moment is not when the structure falls. The most important moment is when the engineer first sees the stress fracture and decides what to do about it. I was not going to fall. I nodded. Once. Not in agreement with the whole of it. Not in the way of a man who has accepted a verdict. In the way of a man who has received information that contains real truth inside a form that is not entirely true, and who is acknowledging the truth without endorsing the form, because both things can be done at the same time by a person who has sufficient control of themselves to do two things at once. I reached for my coffee cup. I finished what was left in it, which was approximately 3 minutes of dark roast, drunk slowly, in the silence of a table that had stopped pretending to be somewhere else and was simply present now, waiting to see what a man who has just been told he was never a real father does with a still hot cup of coffee. He finishes it. I set the cup down. I put bills on the table, enough for the coffee and a reasonable addition, and I stood, and I put on my jacket, and I looked around the table at 11 people, some of whom I knew, and some of whom I was meeting for the first and perhaps only time. And I said, "It's been a good morning. I hope everyone has a safe drive home." And then I left. I drove back to Cincinnati in the quiet that belongs to a man who is doing the only kind of thinking that is worth doing after something large has happened, which is the kind that does not try to resolve things too quickly, that lets the weight of a thing settle before trying to assess it. I thought about the true parts of what Kevin had said. The true parts. I was 2 hours away. I was not there on Tuesday evenings. I called back 4 days late when he was 18 and needed me. I was better at the financial version of fatherhood than the present version, and I used the financial version as a substitute for the present version in too many moments, and I knew I was doing this and did it anyway because the present version required a quality of presence that was harder for me than the financial version, which was easy, which cost me almost nothing in the moment, and which I told myself, convincingly enough to keep going, was the same as being there. These things are true. They have been true for a long time. They do not become untrue because I say other true things alongside them. Then I thought about the parts that were not entirely true or that were true in a way that excluded something important. The word never. You were never a real father. The word never is doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and it is not doing it accurately. The parking lot in October 1999 was real. The 4 hours in the hospital at 14 were real. The campus visit was real. The $40,000 was real, not as a substitute for presents, or not only as that, but as a thing given freely from someone who loved the person he was giving it to and wanted the money to do something useful in a life he cared about. A person who says never knows that it is not never. Never is the version of something that you say when you are trying to make a thing land harder than the accurate version would land. When the accurate version, not enough, not in the right ways, not on the Tuesday evenings, does not carry enough weight for the weight of what you are trying to convey. I understood this. I was not going to argue with it, not then and not in any room with 11 people in it, and also not in my car driving back to Cincinnati, because the arguing was not the point and never had been. I thought about Jennifer's face. I thought about the specific expression I had seen there. Not surprise, not endorsement, not relief, not grief. Something quieter. The expression of a person who has been watching a pattern for a long time and who has a specific, private relationship with what she now knows about where that pattern ends. I thought, she is tired of it, not of the content of Kevin's anger, not the divorce, not the distance, not me specifically, of the form, of the restaurant and the 11 people and the volume and the timing, the using of the true thing as a weapon, which is a different activity from telling the true thing and which she had been on the receiving end of, in some version, for 3 years. I thought about the drinking Carol had noticed. I had noticed it too. I had filed it, and the filing time had run out. I drove home. Carol was in the kitchen. She looked at my face and read it in the way she has read it for 19 years. She said, "How was it?" I said, "He said I was never a real father, in the restaurant, in front of everyone." She was quiet. She came and stood near me and did not immediately say anything, because she understood that the first thing to do was not to say anything, but to be there, which is the thing she has been trying to teach me by example for the better part of 2 decades. After a while she said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I'm still deciding." She said, "What are you deciding?" I said, "Whether the true parts make the whole thing true, or whether the true parts are true and the whole thing is still not accurate." She said, "Both can be real at the same time." I said, "I know." She said, "What did you do?" I said, "I finished my coffee and left." She said, "That was right." I said, "Staying would have been about me." She said, "Yes." I said, "About me needing to respond, needing to explain myself, needing to make the room feel differently than it felt. None of that would have helped Kevin. The only thing that helps Kevin in that moment is watching me receive what he said without being destroyed by it. If I had fallen apart, the scene becomes about my reaction and not about what he said. If I had defended myself, the scene becomes about the argument. Neither of those was what he needed. He needed to watch the words land and not take me down. Because the words were partly true, and a man who says partly true things and then watches them take someone down learns the wrong lesson. She said, "Jennifer was there." I said, "Yes." She said, "What was her face?" I said, "Tired." Carol was quiet for a long moment. She said, "Tom, I think something is coming that isn't about you." The call came Monday morning at 7:43. I was at the desk in my home office with the second cup of the morning, looking at the load calculations for the Kentucky Bridge project that my senior engineer had sent over the weekend, a section of the existing structure that was showing stress indicators that required review before we could certify the rehabilitation plan. The phone rang. "Jennifer," I answered. She said, "Tom, I wanted you to hear this from me before anyone else." I said, "Okay." She said, "I filed for divorce this morning." I put down my coffee cup and I looked out the window at the Cincinnati morning, which was overcast, the kind of overcast that is not dramatic, but is simply the absence of sun, the sky doing its autumn thing. I said, "Jennifer, I'm sorry." She said, "I know, I am too." I said, "Has this been building for a while?" She said, "Yes, a long while. Sunday wasn't the cause. It was the last thing." I said, "What do you mean by the last thing?" She said, "I mean that what Kevin did on Sunday, the way he spoke to you in that room, at that volume, in front of our friends, I have watched him do something like that for 3 years. Smaller versions, different rooms. The target is not always you. The target is usually whoever is closest. And I have told him, more times than I can clearly remember now, that whatever he is carrying, wherever it comes from, however legitimate the origin of it, he cannot keep putting it down on the people around him and calling it honesty. Because honesty is saying, A true thing to help someone understand something. What Kevin does is find the true thing and use it as the sharpest possible instrument. And those are different activities. They produce different results in the people around you. I said, Jennifer. She said, I'm not calling to make you feel responsible. I want to be completely clear about that. What has happened between Kevin and me has its own history that is separate from what happened between you and him, even though they are related in ways I now understand better than I did 3 years ago. I'm calling because you deserve to know, and because—" She paused. "Because you handled Sunday with more dignity than anyone at that table expected, including me. You finished your coffee, Tom. Do you understand how significant that was? You sat there and you received what he said, and you didn't fall apart, and you didn't defend yourself, and you didn't make a scene. You finished your coffee. Kevin needed to see that. I needed to see it. I don't think it did what it needed to do for Kevin yet, but it will eventually, when he's ready to understand what he was actually watching." I said, "Is there anything I can do?" She said, "Not right now. Thank you." A pause. "Eventually, not soon, but eventually, Kevin is going to need to talk to someone who isn't me and isn't you, and who can help him take the weight apart and look at the pieces and understand which ones he actually needs to carry and which ones have just been sitting there because no one ever gave him permission to put them down. But that's not for today." I said, "Take care of yourself, Jennifer." She said, "I will. You too." Kevin called on Wednesday. He said, "Dad." I said, "Kevin?" He said, "Jennifer told me she called you." I said, "Yes." He said, "I don't know what to say." I said, "You don't have to say anything yet. There's time." He said, "What I said on Sunday." I said, "Kevin, stop. Sunday's in the past. I want to know if you're okay right now. This Wednesday, today." Silence. He said, "No, I'm not okay." I said, "I know." He said, "Jennifer." I said, "I know." He said, "I saw it happening, and I couldn't stop it. I kept telling myself it was about external things, money, the house, work stress. If we could just stabilize the practical things, the rest would stabilize, and it didn't, and now—" He stopped. I said, "Kevin, can I say something to you?" He said, "Yes." I said, "I have thought about what you said on Sunday every day since you said it. The parts of it that are true, I have thought about for a long time, since long before Sunday, because I have known which parts are true for years, and I have been looking for the right way to have the conversation about them, and I have not found the right way, and so the conversation has not happened. That is going to change. We are going to have it. In person, just us, not in a restaurant, not with 11 people present, not when you've had a drink and I've driven 2 hours, and the morning has already been arranged into something else, on solid ground, when the ground is solid enough." He said, "Okay." I said, "But I also need to say something else, and I need you to hear it not as defense." He said, "Okay." I said, "The way you said what you said on Sunday, the room, the volume, the audience, the timing, that was not about telling me a truth. A man who wants to tell his father something true does not choose a restaurant full of people to do it. He calls and says, 'Dad, I need to see you. I need to say something to you.' Alone. What happened on Sunday was a weight being dropped, not a truth being delivered. And the people who are closest to you are always in the way when the weight gets dropped, because they love you and they can't move fast enough to get clear. Jennifer has been in the way of that weight. You know that." Long silence. He said, "Yes, I know." I said, "The drinking, Kevin." He said, "I know." I said, "I'm not asking you to explain it to me today. I'm asking you to take it seriously, because everything else, Jennifer, us, your own life, has to stand on something, and that something has to be clear ground. That's not a judgment, that's load-bearing math. My only metaphor. he said after a moment. Load-bearing math. A sound that was in the direction of something lighter than the rest of the call. He said, "Okay." He said, "Dad, I don't actually think you were never there." I said, "I know you don't." He said, "I was trying to say something I don't have the right words for yet." I said, "I know. We are going to find the words. Not today, but we are going to find them." He said, "Okay." He said, "I'll call you." I said, "I'll answer." It has been 6 weeks since that Sunday. Kevin has started seeing a therapist. He told me this in a phone call 2 weeks ago, briefly, in the way people mention things that are real and important and that they are not yet ready to expand on, just the fact, stated and then left there. I told him I was glad. He said it was Carol's suggestion, passed to Jennifer before the divorce, and then eventually to Kevin, which made me think about the particular way good things sometimes travel, through the people who know how to move them, until they reach the person who needs them. Jennifer is, by the accounts I have received through Kevin, doing as well as can be expected for someone who has made a very large and very difficult decision and is now living with it. I think about her with something close to admiration. The thing she did, stopping absorbing the weight and returning it to the person it belonged to, is one of the hardest things a person who loves someone can do, and she did it. And the doing of it was the thing that created the possibility of Kevin actually dealing with what he has been carrying. The real conversation between Kevin and me, the full one, the one I described to him on Wednesday, just the two of us across a table on solid ground, has not happened yet. We are not ready. Kevin's ground is still settling. Mine is solid. It has been solid for a long time because I had Carol and because I had enough years to understand what happened and what it cost and what it meant. But Kevin's ground needs to settle, and I am going to wait for it to settle, because a conversation built on unsettled ground produces more unsettled ground. It will happen. Carol and I drove to Columbus last month, not to see Kevin. We were not at the in-person stage yet. Carol had a landscape project site in the area she wanted to walk. I drove past the street where the restaurant was, not out of any dwelling instinct, not out of the need to revisit, out of the specific engineering habit of returning to a site after an event to see it in different light, to understand what the honest light of September showed and what the October light shows differently. The October light is different from the September light. My father said September showed things as they actually were. What he did not add, and what I have been thinking about since, is that October shows things in the process of becoming something else. The change that has already been decided, being executed visibly. The trees letting go. The shift in angle. Everything moving clearly and without apology toward the next form. I am 57 years old. I have built things that will outlast me by 100 years if the maintenance schedules are followed. I have made choices I cannot undo and choices I would not undo if I could, and choices that live in between those two categories in the specific, uncomfortable territory of things you did the best you could with what you had, and that cost more than the best you could was worth. My son looked at me across a table and said, "I was never a real father." I nodded. I finished my coffee. I left. And I am still here, and the conversation is still waiting, and the ground is going to get solid enough, and when it does, I will be there. My father's first lesson, finish what you start. I have not finished this one yet, but I will. See you in the next one.